We know that in modern times, more and more scientists are coming to conclusion that this universe is unlikely to have appeared by a blind chance. It is very unlikely that this universe made itself out of nothing in the complete absence of mind. And Leonardo da Vinci, the great artist, the great Italian scholar and scientist, used to say that there must be the first reason, the first mastermind, and he called it the first engine that started the universe. The great medieval philosopher Thomas Aquinas, who lived in Europe hundreds of years ago, was talking about the cosmological proof of God, and that is that this complicated and unique world must have had an intellectual beginning at the very start of time. And on top of that, we mentioned that God is not only cosmic absolute or some cosmic power. He is a personality, and he is omnipotent. He can do all things. He is omniscient. He knows all things. He is omnipresent. He fills with himself the whole universe, and he's never changing, and he's full of love for his creation. But today we're traveling to Mesopotamia. Let's go to Iraq. If you go to Smart Traveler, and that is the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade website, and check at various countries, it has three lights: a red light, orange light, or yellow light, and green light. Green light are countries where you can travel without restrictions. Do you know how many countries with green light we have today globally? None. All countries, even the safest, like the United States, Canada, Germany, Great Britain, have yellow light, and that is because COVID-19 is still around. In the past, if the country has no illness, no crime, fairly safe, it's green color. You can travel there, no restrictions. Yellow countries, or orange colors, they show countries where you need to exercise a high degree of caution. And at the moment, because of the global pandemic, wherever you go, even New Zealand, you have to exercise a high degree of caution. And there are countries which are red color, where the Australian website, Department of Foreign Affairs of Trade and Trade says, do not travel. Do not travel. You should not go there. Can you guess which countries you should not travel today? Ukraine, all right. Can you travel to Russia? Red color, don't travel. Can you travel to Syria? Red color. Can you travel to Iraq? Red color. There are some countries where you cannot travel today. But there was a time when these countries were open, and lots of historians and archaeologists did go there and unsurfaced and uncovered a lot of fascinating things. These are some of the ruins of ancient city of Babylon. It's a place which is located about 100 kilometers from the capital of Iraq, Baghdad. These are the buildings which were erected by the last reigning, let's use the word dictator of Iraq, Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein had a dream to actually restore the city of Babylon, rebuild it, and bring it back to its splendor and beauty. Once upon a time, about 2,500 years ago, the city of Babylon was an amazing, absolutely splendid city, located between the two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, in Mesopotamia. They used to grow a lot of plants, great gardens, because the two rivers would flood annually and fertilize the soil with a lot of eel and with a lot of mud, and they would reap great crops. It's fairly hot there in that part of the world. And next slide, please. Okay, and here we have, okay, thank you. Here we have the famous Temple Tower. It used to have 7 layers, or 7 stories. The top layer was made of pure gold, the bottom layer was made of clay. Now, the top layer was made of gold, the next layer was covered with silver, next layer was covered with bronze, the next one was covered with steel sheets, and the bottom ones were partly iron and partly clay. So this was the temple tower of the ancient city of Babylon, called Ziggurat Etemenanki, It was 70 meters high, one of the highest skyscrapers in the ancient civilized world. The only higher buildings were the Egyptian pyramids, which reached all the way to 146 meters. The city of Babylon had the river Euphrates flowing through the city and providing a lot of irrigation and water supplies for the city. And right in the heart of it there stood the palace of King Nebuchadnezzar, and in the heart of the palace he built the first botanical garden in the ancient world. It was called the Hanging Gardens. They brought plants from all over the world to these botanical gardens, and the uniqueness of these gardens is that they were built on terraces. They would put soil on the terraces and plant trees and all sorts of flowers, literally hundreds and thousands of them, brought from Egypt, from Middle Asia, from Persia, from Greece, from everywhere. The Egyptians first used the system that is actually quite widespread in Victoria, New South Wales. You will very seldom see it, but here in Victoria we are using what they call the evaporative cooling system. Have you ever seen the evaporative cooling system? It's not an air conditioning system, but it's a system where the water is sprayed and the air blows and the air is cooled down. So it's not an air conditioning system, but it's the evaporative cooling system that helps drop the temperature in your house in hot summers in Victoria, and it's much cheaper to run than an air conditioner, because air conditioners use a lot of electricity, much more expensive. First evaporative cooling system in the world was actually used by ancient Babylonians. The Babylonian engineers invented this system, and they used to cool down the terraces to the point that the royal family would walk around, and outside it would be 50 above zero. It would be super hot. Can you imagine 50 degrees? But along the terraces the temperature would be nice and comfortable, 20, 25. And that evaporative cooling system was not driven by electricity. There was none in that time, but by hundreds of servants and slaves who were hidden underneath the hanging gardens and who would pump air through water and provide that cooling atmosphere just for one royal family. So hundreds of people, just one royal family. And this becomes one of the 7 wonders of the world, described by the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who wrote about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. As you all know from your reading of history, there were 7 wonders of the world, but only one of them is remaining, and that's the pyramids in Egypt. All other 6 wonders drowned in history. We know their descriptions. We have some archaeological artifacts left from those wonders, but they no longer exist. And it is here that in 1899, the German archaeologist Robert Koldewey, started digging in 1899. And before that time, there was just a mound full of rubble, clay. But when he started digging, he managed to uncover the ruins of the ancient city of Babylon, and he found these clay tablets. Ancient Babylonians, they decided to improve their writing skills, because the Egyptians used hieroglyphics. They used, but hieroglyphs is a very difficult thing to write. So the Babylonians used the so-called cuneiform. They just used little dots, bits and pieces, little drawings. And here is what they found. I have built the fortress of Sagila and Babylon and exalted the glory of my reign forever. And those were the words of King Nebuchadnezzar. They discovered that for hundreds of years, even thousands of years, Babylon was a city, but only a small one, and it did not play a major role in any events happening in the Middle East. But thanks to King Nebuchadnezzar, about 2,600 years ago, the city was rebuilt, renovated, expanded, enlarged, and becomes the capital of the ancient civilized world. There are many, literally thousands of tablets discovered in Babylonia talking about the achievements of this great king who perpetuated his name even on the clay bricks of this ancient city. All we have today is just the ruins. But it is here, in ancient Babylonia, where we find a lot of predictions of the future. Look at the Old Testament statement from Isaiah. For I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning. So in the Old Testament, in the Jewish Christian Bible, God declares that he knows the end from the beginning. In fact, we know that a lot of people historically produced predictions of the future. For instance, you know that just 600 years ago in France, there was the great pharmacist by the name of Michel Nostradamus. Have you ever heard about him? So Michel Nostradamus was a very clever man. He was a good chemist, and he knew a lot in the world of science, and he left behind a lot of predictions of the future. We might talk about some of his predictions next week when we'll talk about the signs of the times and your time and my time. But and you can find predictions in the calendar of Maya. It's in mid-America. You probably heard about the Mayan civilization and the so-called Mayan calendar. You find predictions if you travel to Burma and Myanmar, to Thailand and many other countries. People tried to predict the future. The uniqueness of the Jewish Christian biblical text is that it contains more than 5,000 predictions of the future. In fact, it's the most prophetic book in the world. And it is here. And we have some local predictions, and we have some global predictions. Let me show you a local prediction. In the book of Isaiah, and Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the splendor and pride of the Chaldeans, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. We know from archaeology that Sodom and Gomorrah actually existed, and they might be buried under the waters of the Dead Sea. And the prophecy predicted the fall of ancient Babylon. Let's look at the other prophecy. It will never be inhabited or dwelt in for all generations. So look at this prophecy. It will be never dwelt in, or it'll never be inhabited or dwelt in for all generations. Okay? Look at another prophecy. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, and can you read this word out loud for me? To Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him. This prophecy of Isaiah is written in the 8th century BC. And it would be 200 years later that the Persian king by the name of Kurush or Cyrus will come and win the Babylonians and subdue the city. The prophecy will be fulfilled with mathematical accuracy. And Babylon shall become a heap of what? Can you read it out loud for me? Heap of ruins, without inhabitant. And if you and I travel to Babylon today, you will find that there's a pile of ruins, and all the attempts, even Saddam Hussein's attempts to rebuild it failed. We know that there are many cities in the Middle East, like Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, Jericho, and many others, and they were destroyed multiple times, and they were later rebuilt and now are the capitals of many Middle Eastern countries. However, Babylon was destroyed once, leveled to the ground, and was never rebuilt, and no one lives there, precisely as the prophecy said. And this is what we call a local prophecy, which actually touches or predicts the fate or the doom of a particular nation or a particular person, like King Cyrus. However, in the Old Testament and likewise in the New, you find a lot of global predictions, global prophecies. So there are prophecies local and there are prophecies global. Look at these words. Surely the Lord God does nothing without revealing his secret to his servants. Whom? The prophets. In fact, the creator of the universe doesn't want the human civilization to live in the absence of confidence in the future. He wants us to know what is awaiting us tomorrow. And for this reason, he left behind in this unique ancient document more than 5,000 predictions of the future. By the way, besides local and global predictions, there are also predictions that are literal, and there are predictions that are symbolic. Literal, symbolic, local, global. Local, global, literal, and symbolic. Okay? We've just highlighted only a small handful, just 3 predictions which are local and literal. But now we're going to look at a prophecy which is symbolic and global. The book of Daniel, chapter 2. King Nebuchadnezzar is asleep in his royal palace, and he sees a nightmare. He is super scared. He is very afraid of what is happening. Then the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. We know that in ancient times, the representatives of the so-called occult sciences were quite popular and prominent and played an important role and were often king's advisors. And upon their interpretations, the kings waged wars, engaged in trade, even married their future spouses. They had a tremendous influence on the ancient monarchs. So these people come to King Nebuchadnezzar and ask, "Oh, king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show" what? The interpretation. And the king is warning them. Look, he says, the dream, it was very scary. And if you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb. And they're puzzled because this time they don't know the content of the dream, because they were accustomed to actually hear his story, and then they'll give some kind of an interpretation, often very positive and very promising. But this time they don't know anything, and they think, well, could it be that this is a trap? The Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand." Because of this, the king was angry and very furious, and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be what? Be destroyed. For us, this sounds horrible, because for us in our humanistic age, we like concepts and values like safety, protection, respect of human rights, equality. We despise corruption, we despise slavery, we despise human trafficking, we despise all sorts of crime. We want to build in Australia a wonderful society that'll last for generations. But in those days, it was a different world. It was the world of slavery. It was the world where women were subjected to men and often were considered their property. It was the world where people would destroy each other based on each other's race, where wars were waged all the time, almost every year. And it was the time when the monarch, the king, was the law, and his word was enough to execute anyone as he wished, even if he was angry with that person. So now the command comes, execute everyone. So the decree went forth that the wise men were to be slain, and they sought Daniel and his companions to slay them. We know that at that time, in the city of Babylon, it was 2,600 years ago, around 605 BC, a lot of captives were brought from the land of Israel, because Nebuchadnezzar captured Israel and would later, in a couple of decades, completely destroy the city of Jerusalem and would level it to the ground. Just like his city of Babylon would be destroyed about 70 years later by the Persians, and later by the Greeks once again. So what we know is that amongst many wise people, there were also a group of Jewish young men, highly educated, very proficient, graduates of the school of King Nebuchadnezzar near his palace, and they had to share the fate. They had to accept the doom of all the wise men in Babylon and be executed with them. Daniel travels to the king's palace and asks him to give him just one night, when he will ask his God. Maybe God will give him the revelation and the interpretation of this very strange dream. What a capricious king that is, that his dream would actually determine the life and death of dozens or maybe hundreds of people. Just think about how capricious and how unpredictable the ancient rulers were, if the wrong word could ignite their anger as to destroy literally scores and scores of people. So in the morning, Daniel comes to King Nebuchadnezzar and says, "No wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery which the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. And he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in what? Can you read it out loud for me? In the latter days. The latter days. The last days. So this is not just a dream. This is not a nightmare that some of us might have if we had a very generous supper just before we went to bed. That is why my wife always tries to make sure that I don't eat too late in the evening, because I always see a nuclear war or something horrible at night if I had a very late supper. But it was not a nightmare. It was actually a supernatural revelation, a supernatural prediction that says what will happen even at the end of time. And then Daniel says, "You saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its breast and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of what? Of bronze." I think you might remember at the beginning of our presentation tonight, I mentioned the great temple tower that stood in the middle of the city of Babylon. It was the main temple dedicated to the gods of ancient Babylonia. The top of that tower, the top floor was covered with gold. It was not made of gold. It was just covered with golden sheets. The next floor down was covered with silver sheets. The next floor down was covered with copper and bronze sheets. The next floor down with steel sheets. And then there were floors made of clay. So you will notice that this image, by containing those metals and elements, is very similar to the metals used in the main temple of ancient Babylonia. In fact, ancient Babylonians were not only great astrologers and astronomers, they were good scholars and scientists, but they were also very religious people. And in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, they built more than 600 temples and shrines in that city. And given that the city was fairly small in size, there were a shrine or a temple to a deity almost every 20 or 30 meters. That's how devout the Babylonians were in their religious beliefs. But at the same time, we know that Babylonians had a lot of very strange customs, because they believed that that gods, when they get angry with humans, they need to be appeased. They need to be appeased by human sacrifices. And it is for this reason that in Babylonia they had this very strange custom. When women had their firstborn child, they normally sacrificed that child to the Babylonian gods. And only the second, third, and fourth children onwards they could keep for themselves. So the first child had to be actually sacrificed. Can you imagine the mindset of women in that city when that little baby, fragile, warm, so nice, and you have to kill that child? And in fact, those children were burnt alive, dedicated to Babylonian gods. They also had a very strange custom. One of the Babylonian goddesses was goddess Ishtar. Ishtar, you probably heard about Ishtar, right? And her equivalent in Egypt is Isis. You probably heard about Isis because of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. But Isis was in Egypt, and Ishtar was in ancient Babylon. And that's where we get our English word Easter from. Okay, the word Easter comes to us from Ishtar, the ancient Babylonian goddess. So in springtime, when Babylonians celebrated the day of Ishtar, ladies, almost all women in Babylon who were of age sufficient to produce children would go out. They would drink a special narcotic drink, and their husbands would actually let them go, and they would engage in a sexual activity outside as their worship to Ishtar. And so again, a lot of those women would get pregnant, and in 9 months, in December, they would give birth to little children. And those children conceived on the day of Ishtar and born in December, they would be dedicated to the god of the sun, and they would be all sacrificed at the end of December. So that was another custom that Babylonians had. So this was civilization on one hand with a lot of advancement in mathematics, in astronomy, in physics, even in chemistry. We are still benefiting from the achievements of ancient Babylonians nowadays, but at the same time, the religious beliefs of Babylonians contained a lot of cruelty, and they included human sacrifices and forced temple prostitution of women. Well, the head of this image was of fine gold, its breast and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze. If you could just click the next slide for me. Its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it smote the image on its feet of iron and clay, and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken in pieces and became like the chaff on the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So that was the dream. And if in previous instances we looked at local predictions and literal predictions, this is a global prediction and a symbolic one. And I'll look at the explanation which Daniel would later give to King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel says, "You are" what? Can you read it for me? The head of gold. So Nebuchadnezzar and the kingdom of Babylon that is represented by him is the golden head in this prophecy. The golden head is King Nebuchadnezzar. And historians today, by reading history of Babylon, they agree with the words of Daniel. They believe that Nebuchadnezzar's time was the golden time, and Babylon indeed was the golden kingdom. In fact, in the ancient world, no other country, no other kingdom had so much gold accumulated because of its conquests of the foreign lands as the kingdom of Babylonia. Nebuchadnezzar decorated almost everything with gold in Babylonia: buildings, temples, streets, banks of the river Euphrates. Everything was decorated with gold. And ancient travelers describing their journey to Babylon tell them about how stunned they were as they approached, riding their horses or mules or donkeys or just walking on foot. Several kilometers away, they would see this shining wonder in the Mesopotamia, in the blazing sun. They would see the shining city full of gold, gold reflecting the sun everywhere, right, left, and center. King Nebuchadnezzar left this statement for us: "The excellence of this kingdom, may it do what? Last forever." These are the words found on one of those many tablets, clay tablets. However, if you look at the prophecy, Nebuchadnezzar obviously forgot that the image had a head of gold, but then comes a different section, a different part. "After you shall arise" what? Another kingdom inferior to yours. And we know that a few decades would pass and the golden glory of Babylon would fade. Look at the prophecy that we read at the beginning of our presentation. "Thus says the Lord to his anointed," to whom? Cyrus, "whose right hand I have grasped, to open doors before him, that gates may not be closed." And Kurush, or Cyrus, hadn't been even born at that time when the Bible called him by his first name. 200 years later, the prophecy was fulfilled. It would be King Cyrus who would conquer Babylonia. Look at another statement from the book of Jeremiah. It happened just a few decades before the fall of Babylon. "A drought upon her waters, that they may be dried up, for it is a land of images, and they're mad over idols." So the prophecy said that there will be... what happened? So the prophecy said that there would be what? A drought. Now, in Australia, we know what droughts are. There would be a drought on the waters of Babylon. And how could you bring drought on the waters of Babylon? Well, we know that when Persians came, they besieged the city, they surrounded it, and at night, unbeknown to the defenders of this ancient city, they started digging a canal. The canal was designed to divert the river Euphrates away from the city of Babylon and around it. During the day, they would bring lots of dancers and cymbals and army and play and try to cover and mask the canal as much as they could so that the Babylonians would not see it. But finally, they succeeded. The water of the river Euphrates started flowing around the city, and one night, the traitor, one of the nobles of Babylon, as historians tell us, opened the gates, and walking on the riverbed of the river Euphrates, the Persian soldiers rushed into the city, set the city alight, and it was captured. And about the conquest of Babylon, you and I may read on this cylinder that was found in Iran about 70 years ago. It's the cylinder of King Cyrus. And it is on this very cylinder that in cuneiform, in ancient Persian language, King Cyrus describes his conquest of Babylonia. This is King Cyrus himself. And you find this in the place called Persepolis, on the Beheston rock in Persia or in Iran today. And yet a third kingdom of what? Of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. So there was Babylon, the golden head, Persia, the silver chest and arms, and we know that the Persian kingdom was big and mighty, but it was not as wealthy and rich and as splendid as Babylon. And the Persians had to be pleased just with silver, because all the gold was taken by the Babylonian kings. And it would be silver coins and silver metals that the conquered nations would deliver to ancient Persians. And now comes a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over what? All the earth. Now, the term all the earth, for Daniel, who is sitting in Babylon, it's the known world. It's the Middle East and the Mediterranean. So all of that will be covered by the third kingdom. And we know that when the Persians ruled for about 200 or 300 years, they constantly waged wars with ancient Greeks. And you probably heard about many stories and watched movies, read about this in history books, about the 300 brave Spartans who fought a gigantic Persian army, the battle of Thermopylae or Thermopylae, the burning of Athens by the Persian king Darius, and many other great stories of those great wars between the Persians and the Greeks. The Marathon battle, the same. Finally, the Greeks scrambled their forces, and there comes a king from northern Greece by the name of Philip the Macedonian, and he bribed a lot of Greek cities and brought them together and formed one army. And he appointed a young general in charge of that army. Who knows the name of that general? It was Alexander. Alexander the Macedonian, or Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great becomes, in his young age, in his early 20s, the general of the world's most equipped and best trained army. In fact, when Alexander comes with his army and fights the Persians, it becomes one of the most unique battles in the history of mankind. So basically what happens is the Persian army in the field had 1 million soldiers. Just think about it. 1 million soldiers, the biggest army ever put together. And King Darius was confident that the army of Alexander had no chances. The army of Alexander the Great, in contrast, had only 30,000 soldiers. So it was outnumbered 33 times. And yet, Alexander the Great managed in one day to destroy and send to flight the entire Persian army. He did not destroy every soldier, but the Persian army lost and ran and fled. And Alexander would later continue on and travel all the way with his conquests to India and defeat the Indian army of King Porus at the river Hydaspes. He would win almost every battle except the battle of Scythians in Middle Asia. Scythians are somehow related to the Slavic nations, as historians tell us. So Alexander the Great expanded the boundaries of the Greek world and made it the biggest kingdom of its time. And we know that in his conquest of the Middle East, he approached the city of Tyre. It was one of the capitals of the Phoenician world. The Phoenicians were the great shipbuilders and sailors, and the Phoenicians did not surrender. So the city of Tyre was destroyed. But when his army approached the city of Jerusalem, the Jerusalem defenders not only surrendered, but they actually welcomed him into the city. And the priests came to King Alexander, and they showed him the prophecy of Daniel. They read to him the prophecy of Daniel, saying, "You are the fulfillment of the prophecy of Daniel." And Alexander the Great was so impressed that he actually ordered to translate the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek language, which was later done in the city of Alexandria. And that's where we take the translation called the Septuagint, or the translation of 70 interpreters, of 70 translators. So Alexander was really impressed, because people from ancient times, from the days of Daniel and the kingdom of Babylonia, from Persian days, Greek days, people kept track of the fulfillment of every element of this prophecy. I know that you must be getting very tired, because this is a lengthy lecture, but I give you a promise, we will be finished in 12 minutes, all right? Because often when the plane flies and flies and flies, and you think, when are we going to land? Well, don't worry, my friends, we're in descent mode, and we are going to land in 12 minutes. Well, Alexander the Great, but his greatness would not last forever. The prophecy said there shall be a what? A fourth kingdom, strong as what? Strong as iron. Because iron breaks into pieces and shatters all things, and like iron which crushes, it shall break and crush all these. And we know that Greece would reign for about 200 years, and it would be succeeded by the great Iron Kingdom. First a republic, first some kind of a democracy, but later a monarchy and dictatorship. It would be the great Iron Rome. The Roman emperors would leave not a stone from the Greek kingdom. First it would be the Roman consuls, and later the great Roman generals and emperors. This is the great Arch of Triumph in Rome, and it would be through this very arch that almost every year the Roman generals would arrive with triumphs, with those great parades and processions, and declare new victories. And the Romans conquered most of that world. By the way, it is in the days of the Romans that Christianity would first appear, and this picture actually shows the Christians being destroyed in Rome, being fed to lions, burned on the stake. Of course, you've got the remains of the great ancient Colosseum, great circuses they had. And Jesus Christ would be crucified by the Roman general and by the Roman soldiers. These are the Roman soldiers carrying the objects from the temple of King Solomon when the Jewish temple was destroyed in the city of Jerusalem. So the Roman Empire would cover most of southern Europe, Middle Asia, northern Africa, and even Caucasus Mountains. And the only other empire that would be bigger in size and population at that time would be China. But China would be in Asia, but Rome would be the biggest empire in the European world. And look at an important detail. And as you saw the feet and toes partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it shall be a what? A divided kingdom. So we know, according to the prophecy, the Roman Empire would split. It will be divided. But some of the firmness of iron shall be in it, just as you saw iron mixed with the miry clay. So we know that Rome would last for hundreds and hundreds of years. In fact, some Roman historians said that it is an everlasting city. Everlasting Rome, they said. It will reign forever. For as long as time lasts, Rome will be the capital of the world. But 476 comes, the 5th century, and the Roman Empire is divided. It started its division long before that, because it first broke into the Western Roman Empire with a capital in Rome, and the Eastern Roman Empire with a capital in the city of Constantinople, or modern Istanbul. We know that the Eastern Roman Empire would exist until the 15th century. The Eastern Roman Empire would exist until the 15th century, until it would be completely subdued in 1453 by the Turks and the Ottoman Empire. But the Western Roman Empire finished in 476 AD. Torn by many invasions during the great relocation or the great transfer of nations, because we know that it took about 200 years for the Huns, Goths, Heruli, Vandals, and many others to relocate from many European countries and attack the aging Roman Empire. And like wolves tear their prey, that's what those nations did to the Roman Empire. They were the brave Alemannis, Burgundians, Franks, Lombards, Saxons, Sueves, Visigoths, Heruli, Vandals, Ostrogoths, and many others. They divided the Roman Empire. They tore it into many little pieces. But look at an important detail. As you saw the iron mixed with miry clay, so they will mix with one another in what? In marriage. And we know that if you travel to modern Europe, you will discover that most European royal families, they're a blend. They're a mix of multiple royal families in their history. And we know that if you look at Queen Elizabeth and read the articles of how many bloods she has, you will be stunned to discover that Queen Elizabeth is a relative to almost every royal family in Europe, even the family of the Russian kings. We know that hundreds of years ago in Russia there lived a king by the name Ivan the Terrible. Have you ever heard about Ivan the Terrible? Ivan the Terrible was called terrible because he killed 4,000 of his nobles. And also he was terrible because he was married 6 times, and 5 of his wives survived for probably 2 or 3 years. And so can you imagine being a wife of such a king? In fact, when he was trying to get married, he would probably they would summon all the beautiful girls in that country, sometimes up to 15,000 girls, and it would take him for about 6 months to choose the future wife. And when those girls were sent by their parents to be viewed by the king, parents cried as if they were burying their daughter, because they knew the fate and the doom that most wives of Ivan the Terrible died under very horrible circumstances. When he actually became a widow for the 4th time, Ivan the Terrible decided to propose to, you know whom? Queen Elizabeth of England. Great Queen Elizabeth, who, you remember, defeated the Spanish Armada in the English Channel with the help of the great pirate Francis Drake. So can you imagine Queen Elizabeth receiving a letter from Ivan the Terrible with a proposal to marry? And Queen Elizabeth writes, she was a great woman, Queen Elizabeth, and she wrote him a very kind letter saying, Royal Majesty would be greatly honored to make a lawful covenant with the Russian Tsar. But our heart has already been pledged to someone else. So that was a kind reply. So then he tried to propose to her niece. There was her niece, the royal niece. And the poor niece complained to Queen Elizabeth that she would rather die than travel to Russia and marry Ivan the Terrible. So Queen Elizabeth had to write another letter. And actually, I read all those letters in the regional language, in ancient Slavic and also in the English of that time. And so the Queen Elizabeth wrote very politely and laconically saying that our royal niece would be greatly honored to make a covenant with the Russian Tsar. But she's not beautiful enough for him. So that was an answer that cut off the ties and never enabled that bond to happen. Well, most royal families are connected in Europe. Okay, they're all Europe is mixed in marriages. But look at the prophecy, and this is recorded 2,600 years ago. But they will not hold what? Together, just as iron does not mix with clay. There will not be one more global empire. And we know that a lot of great warriors and kings and generals try to challenge this prophecy. In fact, it started over 1,000 years ago. Charles the Great king in Europe, in 862 AD, formed what they call the Holy Roman Empire. He decided he was successful in conquering most kingdoms in Europe and making them one big kingdom. And the reason why he called it is because he was approached by the Roman Catholic priests of his time, who said that, Charles, the prophecy of Daniel says that you will not be able to build one big empire. And Charles the Great, who was a Christian, said, well, therefore let's dedicate this kingdom to God, and we will call it not the Roman Empire, but it'll be the Holy Roman Empire dedicated to Jesus Christ. However, when he died, it fell out. It got split into many pieces, and the empire never was not to last. We know that Napoleon Bonaparte made attempts, and he was almost successful. Some German great warriors like Kaiser Wilhelm, Adolf Hitler, many of them tried to bring not only Europe but the entire world together. And they almost succeeded, but they all failed. The prophecy said they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. In fact, this is the Allies, Winston Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin, deciding the fate of the world at the end of the Second World War. And it was 5 years before 1940 that many European newspapers had discussions talking about the prophecy of Daniel and asking questions. Will Hitler be able to break the prophecy of Daniel and see if he can actually build one global empire? As you see, people on earth have been tracking and tracing the fulfillment of prophecy of Daniel for the last 2,600 years. It happened in the days of Daniel. It happened in the days of ancient Persians, Greeks, Romans, and it happened even in the recent 100 years when people were trying to decide the destiny and the doom of the world. And we know that even the European Union is a very fragile structure because, number one, it's not one kingdom, it's just an economical political alliance. Number two, you know that some countries as noble as the UK organized their Brexit, marking the potential decline of the European Union as an alliance of many countries. So we'll live and see. Let's see what happens in the near future. But in the days of those kings, Daniel says, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and nor shall its sovereignty be left to another people. It shall break all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand for how long? Forever. Just as you saw cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, a great God has made known to the king what shall be hereafter. The dream is certain, and its interpretation what? Sure. Today, even the worst skeptic who reads the prophecy of Daniel and looks at the flow of history will not be able to negate the fact that the prophecy is actually true, and it was fulfilled with mathematical accuracy. And of course, the future of the world is very, very optimistic. We know that according to the scripture, there's going to be a divine intervention into human history, and there will be a new era, a new time in the development of humankind when there will be no more suffering and no more death. And let me tell you, I think the events of the last 2.5 years, they are sparking more and more interest of humankind to actually reach that world as soon as possible. Tell me, were you tired of the pandemic when it went for such a long time? It's still around, not as dangerous as it was with the previous strains. Now that we have the stealth Omicron and Omicron, it's a bit lighter. But the pandemic was very exhausting. It was very tiring. And now, when it appeared that there was a little break, now we have this armed conflict in the heart of Europe again, and people are saying, when will this finish? I wish the world was different. Well, the Old Testament prophecy says the world will be different. There will be a different era, a different time. Look at the summary. So 2,600 years ago, in the ancient city of Babylon, thank you, there was the king by the name of Nebuchadnezzar. Brilliant. And he saw a dream, and in the dream he saw an image with a head of gold, chest of silver, thighs of brass or bronze, legs of iron and feet of iron and clay. And if you track this prophecy through history, you'll find Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, divided Europe, and divided world in general. And then the stone symbolizes the divine intervention into human history when the cosmic reality will meet the earthly reality, and it'll be the beginning of a great and wonderful time. And we will talk about these things in the upcoming lectures. But let's go back to Daniel's time and look at the words of God. Shut up the words, God said, and seal the book until the time of what? Of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. And we're living in a day and age when knowledge is increasing. People are traveling the world. We're living in a unique global world, and we are the eyewitnesses of the fulfillment of ancient prophecies. But let me summarize our presentation with this phrase. We read this at the end of our first presentation on Saturday. Now acquaint yourself with him and be at what? At peace. Thereby good will come to you. If we actually get to know this Creator, peace will come into our hearts and we will be happy. Could I see the hands of those who want to have peace in their hearts? I want to have peace in my heart and peace in my mind. And I want peace to fill the lives and hearts of all Australians.